Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Power was Winston Churchill's natural environment. The power of a famous name, of influential connections, of an education which gave Englishmen the confidence and arrogance to rule the greatest empire the world has known. By the end of the 19th century, he had had his share of adventure in this empire, and he even contrived to take part in the war in South Africa, which opened the 20th century. The Boers took him prisoner in that war, and when he escaped, put a price on his head. Churchill survived, and the power of survival turned out to be one of his most notable characteristics. Entering Parliament at the age of 25, he was to spend more than 50 years at the center of political power. As the 20th century advanced, so Churchill's experience of office grew. He was First Lord of the Admiralty when the First World War broke out. Knowing the truth of the Latin saying, if you want peace, prepare for war, he warned his fellow countrymen against the rising power of the European dictators. But his warnings were ignored. In 1939, he was still there, 65 years of age, pugnacious, determined to win. From a close knowledge of the man, Drew Middleton of the New York Times sums up Churchill at this time.
He had a very checkered career. He was in very high office in the First World War, fell from office, changed parties, was admired by the few, reviled by many. He had a small group in the House of Commons who stuck to him. He constantly preached the danger of Hitler and Mussolini in the future. Then, of course, when war did come, in September 1939, he became First Lord of the Admiralty, his old post, and he was almost within reach of the supreme power he wanted.
We have been agreeably surprised that 10 weeks have been allotted to us to get into fighting trim. We are in a very different position from that we were in 10 weeks ago. We are far stronger than we were 10 weeks ago. We are far better prepared to endure the worst malice of Hitler and his Huns than we were at the beginning of September. I shall not attempt to prophesy whether the frenzy of a cornered maniac will drive Herr Hitler into the worst of all his crimes. But this I will say, without a doubt, that the fate of Holland and Belgium, like that of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Austria, will be decided by the victory of the British Empire and the French Republic.
On May 10th, 1940, Neville Chamberlain, leader of the policy of appeasement, resigned. Churchill took over as Prime Minister. He wrote later of this moment, "At last I had the opportunity to give directions over the whole scene. I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial." Prospects for Churchill could hardly have been worse. Within 2 weeks of his becoming Britain's war leader, the German armies were at the English Channel, and Britain's expeditionary force had to be evacuated from Dunkirk. A month later, France gave in, and Britain stood alone. Hitler deluded himself that Churchill would sue for peace.
Herr Churchill mag der Überzeugung sein, dass Großbritannien siegen wird. Ich zweifle keine Sekunde, dass Deutschland siegt.
Boasting in his strength, the Nazi Goliath planted his feet over Europe and taunted his enemy across the English Channel.
Keinem etwas zu Leide tun und von keinem ein Leid erdulden.
Never did so mocking a fantasy obsess the mind of mortal man. We cannot tell what the course of this fell war will be, and it spreads remorseless through ever wider regions. We know it will be hard. We expect it will be long. We cannot predict or measure its episodes or its tribulations.
Wir wollen dem französischen Volk die Hand geben. Wir wollen nicht diesen ewigen, wahnsinnigen Kampf weiterführen.
But one thing is certain. One thing is sure. One thing stands out stark and undeniable, massive and unassailable for all the world to see. It will not be by German hands that the structure of Europe will be rebuilt, or the union of the European family achieved. But nothing is more certain than that every trace of Hitler's footsteps, every stain of his infected and corroding fingers will be sponged and purged, and if need be, blasted from the surface of the earth.
In the late summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain decided the fate of the free world. And it was won, as Churchill said, by the few, Britain's fighter pilots.
Well, we were detailed for the fighters, actually, up above. And I got a cert 110.
Oh, nice work.
Saw the two chaps bail out.
And on to Paris, yeah?
Yes, and one of their parachutes, unfortunately, or fortunately, didn't open.
Aha.
Churchill, whether from modesty, which wasn't one of his outstanding characteristics or not, always said that he happened to be there, but that the British people would have done it anyway, under anyone. I think Kennedy's remark is he mobilized the British people. He gave the cause a nobility. He knew nothing about them in the sense that he didn't share their sports, their pleasures, probably never rode in a bus or an underground in his life. But yet he knew basically how they felt about things and was able to put that into words.
Hitler took it for granted that when France gave in, we should give in. But we did not give in, and he had to think again. An invasion now will be supported by a much more carefully prepared tackle and equipment of landing craft and other apparatus, all of which will have been planned and manufactured during the winter months. We must all be prepared to meet gas attacks, parachute attacks, and glider attacks with constancy, forethought, and practiced skill. In order to win the war, Hitler must destroy Great Britain. With every month that passes, the many proud and once happy countries he is now holding down by brute force and vile intrigue are learning to hate the Prussian yoke and the Nazi name as nothing has ever been hated so fiercely and so widely among men before. And all the time, masters of the sea and air, the British Empire, nay, in a certain sense, the whole English-speaking world, will be on his track, bearing with them the swords of justice. We shall not fail or falter, we shall not weaken or tire. Neither the sudden shock of battle nor the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down. Give us the tools and we will finish the job.
Continental Europe lay under the Nazi yoke, but across the Atlantic was the great arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt described it. Between the English-speaking peoples, Churchill felt there was a special bond, stronger than political necessity. His mother, after all, had been an American. As war spread and Britain found allies, he never lost an opportunity to bolster their spirits with his own bulldog temperament. From Canada's Parliament buildings, his words were relayed by radio across all North America and to Britain's dominions throughout the world.
We have not asked that the rules of the game should be modified. If any, we shall never descend to the German and Japanese level. But if anybody likes to play rough, we can play rough too.
Mr. Churchill then spoke of his talks with President Roosevelt.
We have been conducting the united pacts and resolves of more than 30 states and nations to fight on in unity together and in fidelity, one with another, without any thought except the total and final extirpation of the Hitler tyranny, of the Japanese frenzy, and the Mussolini flop.
Then he spoke of the dark days when France was tottering to collapse.
When I warned them that Britain would fight on alone, whatever they did, their generals told their Prime Minister and his divided cabinet, in 3 weeks, England will have her neck wrung like a chicken. Some chicken. Some neck. Let us then, sir, address ourselves to our task, not in any way underrating its tremendous difficulties and perils, but in good heart and sober confidence, resolved that whatever the cost, whatever the suffering, we shall stand by one another, true and faithful comrades, and do our duty, God helping us, to the end.
Churchill loved battles. As a boy, he played with toy soldiers. As a young man, he took part in action wherever he could. And when there was no fighting to be done, he wrote about battles instead. As Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, he never lost a chance to be up near the front.
he was extremely good at, with one or two exceptions, at selecting his military leaders. Of course, he had a good class to pull from. I mean, he had Alexander, Slim, Mountbatten, who was better than people thought, I believe, Montgomery, and a whole group of good corps commanders. The Army would say, well, so-and-so, Horrocks is going to command 20th Corps. Well, he would go back and look up Horrocks' record, have men talk to him. And he often vetoed the selections.
Churchill twice spoke in Congress. The friendship of America was very precious to him, and Americans loved him.
It is the duty of those who are charged with the direction of the war to overcome at the earliest moment the military, geographical, and political difficulties and begin the process so necessary and desirable of laying the cities and other munition centers of Japan in ashes, for in ashes they must surely lie before peace comes back to the world. And here let me say, let no one suggest that we British, have not at least as great an interest as the United States in the unflinching and relentless waging of war against Japan. And I am here to tell you that we will wage that war side by side with you in accordance with the best strategic employment of our forces, while there is breath in our bodies and while blood flows in our veins.
Churchill also made it his business to establish a personal relationship with the leaders of the Soviet Union after Germany had attacked Russia. Putting past differences behind him, he flew to Russia to meet Stalin.
I think at his first meeting with Stalin, he had to tell him that there would be no major operation in Western Europe until 1944. He was roundly berated for this, but being a good, tough man himself, he gave as good as he got. The evening ended up with a drinking session. On the other hand, I think in Stalin, he in some way saw a kindred character, a man who believed in sort of old-fashioned political ideas, spheres of influence, which of course is dead against the Wilsonian concepts that FDR was brought up on.
At Casablanca early in 1943, Roosevelt first announced the policy of unconditional surrender.
In the cabinet room at Downing Street, I went in to one of the meetings that were arranged occasionally between American correspondents and the Prime Minister, and I raised this point about unconditional surrender and said, "You look very surprised, sir." And he said, "I was surprised," and went on to say that he saw it being done differently. There were diplomatic courses, but that he was Roosevelt's ardent lieutenant. Between Casablanca and the end of the war, he certainly eased our policy on unconditional surrender.
At Tehran, later in 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt met with Stalin. The scale of the war meant that Churchill's role was turning into one of influencing allies who were on the up and up, while Britain's resources had been depleted by her solitary stand in 1940 and 41. Three grand masters of power with the world as their chessboard. At Jalta early in 1945, agreements were made which proved disastrous for the future of Europe.
Where we went wrong on Jalta was to give up so much of Germany, which we were already occupying. I think that both of them still felt that by meeting Russian demands, you could establish a stable situation in Europe, that the Russians wouldn't go any further. And it was one of the things that shook everybody in the Europe of the late 40s, how far the Russians did go after having given all these agreements not to go.
This was Jalta, a picture that speaks of treachery, of sickness and miscalculation, of decisions affecting the lives of millions. Soon after, the war ended.
General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied expeditionary forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom! God save the King!
The long war was over, a war which could have been avoided if Churchill's warnings had been heeded in the 30s. It mattered little that he was proved right. At least he survived to lead his country to ultimate victory. The lion roared, he once said, and it was given to me to voice that roar on behalf of our people. Now victory was theirs, and the old lion would soon be led out into the shade.
This was Churchill's finest hour. He had led the people and Parliament by his speeches. He had directed the war, both in the military and the political aspect. He had made the civil service work as never before, and he had given the world an example of what he and Britain could do. But even in this hour of victory, defeat is just around the corner.
The people had a right to shout for their king. The real power in the end belonged to them. That was how Britain had won the war.